The story of the Sophists, in many ways, is the origin story of our good dead friends, Socrates and Plato. To begin the story of the Sophists, we have to go back in time to the 5th century BC, and we have to go to the city of Athens. Now, back then, it was an age of gold. Why? Well, Athens was a center of culture and a center of commerce. It was also rich in the advances of arts, philosophy, and sciences. And Athens was also, at times, a democracy. But, as so often is the case, the Golden Age was also an age of irony. There was a moral and cultural malaise in effect. Respect for the ideals, laws, religion, and customs had begun to fall apart. So in many ways, we are like Athens. We are a center of culture and commerce. We are rich in the advances in the arts, philosophy, and science. And we are, at times, a democracy. But we also live in an age of irony, because we do have a moral and cultural malaise in effect, and respect for the ideals, laws, religion, and customs have begun to fall apart. Now, why did this happen back in ancient Athens, and why is it happening today? Because although we are obviously in a different time and place, one might say the laws of culture and humanity remain the same across time. So in ancient Athens, there was a decline in respect for traditional authorities, including both secular and theological. Same thing we have today. Respect for government is at an all-time low. The religious leaders, although some enjoy great popularity, they're also under doubt. The Athenians had considerable contact with other cultures, as do we. One impact of this is that encountering other cultures can have the effect of accepting relativism, something we saw earlier, the idea that truth is relative. Now, one of the great Greek historians, considered by many to be the father of history, is our good dead friend Herodotus, and he declared famously that custom is king. Essentially that what people grew up with, what is the custom in their culture, is what they regard as good. And he seemed to go as far as to argue that that is what makes it good. He has a classic essay which is often titled today, Custom is King. Now, what about democracy? Well, democracy, of course, does have advantages. A democratic system leads to increased individualism, which has pluses and minuses, and it also can open avenues of advancement. If you don't have a system of nobles, and you have, say, true democracy, where people can, they're not locked into a rigid political system, there are avenues for people to advance. Now, there's also, of course, disagreement among philosophers and scientists. And one impact of this, although disagreement is part of the profession of philosophy, also the profession of scientists, the constant disagreement among these philosophers and scientists led to skepticism about metaphysics. Because you have Thales saying, it's all water. You have Heraclitus saying it's all fire. You have someone else saying it's earth, air, wind, and fire. And others saying other things. And all these smart people are saying different things. And it's natural to say, how can we know? Let us accept skepticism. There was also an increased focus on practical matters, like success and power. Something, obviously, that's been true throughout history. Now, one of the major changes in Athens is that political power was no longer based primarily on birth. Namely, like you weren't just born to be like the king because your dad was a king and your mom was the queen. But it was based on the ability to sway and influence the masses. And all this is very similar to the way things are today, which is not surprising because people generally have remained very similar throughout history, and we see the same stories repeated over and over again. Now, into this situation arose the Sophists. They stepped in to address these practical matters. So what did the Sophists do? Well, their offer was this. They said to people, if you give us money, we'll offer you education and training so you can sway the masses to gain influence and power. One of the most famous of the Sophists is our good dead friend Protagoras. He claimed that he could teach people to order their affairs and the affairs of the state, and they could become successful. So where does the term sophist come from? Well, much like philosophy, obviously, it comes from Sophia, meaning, wisdom. And they're called sophists, and philosophers, of course, are called, philosophers. Now, thanks to Socrates, the hero of the story, and Plato and Aristotle, the sophists are generally presented as frauds, deceivers, wrong, and often presented in a very negative light. Now, to be fair, of course, the story is written by, Plato and Aristotle, and they are, of course, the heroes of their own stories. Or rather, Socrates is the hero of Plato's story. Aristotle's the hero of his own story. And so their opponents, the sophists, would be cast in a very negative light. So we should, of course, take that into account. So what did the sophists, contribute? What did they stand for? Well, kind of their main things would be skepticism, relativism, and, seemingly oddly enough, success. So what about the skepticism? Well, even before our good dead friend Socrates, philosophers known as the pre-Socratics spent a lot of time disagreeing with each other. As I noted before, you'd have Thales saying it's all water, Heraclitus saying it's all fire, other philosophers saying it's other stuff. And so the sophists looked at that and saw them, all these brilliant people arguing, unable to reach the truth, and so they took what might be seen as an obvious course, namely accepting skepticism. And skepticism, of course, is a philosophic position that we don't know. We lack knowledge. Now, once a person gets caught up in skepticism, it's natural to sort of slide over into relativism, although they're different. You can be a skeptic without being a relativist. But skepticism tends to move someone towards relativism. So if you believe that we lack knowledge, then it kind of makes sense to accept relativism, the view that truth, most especially moral truth, is relative. If you can't know, then just go with whatever your culture kind of says. So what effect did skepticism and relativism have on the sophist? Well, if you can't know stuff and everything's relative, so how do you decide what to do? What do you do to fill your days? Well, the sophists came to the conclusion that what matters is success. So, whereas someone like Socrates, later on, and philosophers, of course, before him, were engaged in what they regarded as a search for truth, the sophists did what today we would call branding. They were, in some ways, the earliest of the branders, because they turned from the search for truth to the marketing of their ideas. So their thing was not, I have something that is probably true. It's, I have these really sweet ideas that are well marketed, well branded, give me money. Now, this turned also from the desire to be morally right, to be a good person, to the desire to simply succeed. And again, this does make some sense. If you can't know stuff, and there's really no objective morality, you can't find truth, then what are you going to do? Well, one obvious solution is make money off your ideas. If nothing is objectively good or bad, what do you do? Well, why not become really successful? Now, the sophists were not, for the most part, not all of them, sort of total relativists. Why not? Well, they made a distinction between nomos and physis. And no, even though it looks like, it's misspelled, it's not. It's like a English version of the Greek. So physis, not misspelled, means nature, and these are the aspects of reality that even most sophists would accept as objective. So if you asked like a typical sophist, hey, do you believe there are, buses and roast beef sandwiches and squirrels and stuff, they would say, yeah. If you asked them, would you go and, stick your head in a fire, they'd say, well, no, that's physis. That's, real stuff that's objective. For the most part, their relativism and skepticism focus primarily on nomos, which is the subjective, what they regard as subjective relative realm of human convention. So they regard nomos as stuff that's set up by the individual, by the culture, based on convention. For example, think of like the rules of etiquette. Those are entirely, made up. Which fork you use, what you say after a meal, how you greet people on the phone, just totally made up, all subjective and relative. Now, the sophists contended that ethics, morality, should be in that realm, the realm of mere convention that's utterly subjective or relative. So ethics is simply a matter of, culture, individual convention. Now, this is a view people still hold to this day. It's something you can't just simply assume that morality is all just relative, because that would beg the question, assume it needs to be proven, but they had arguments for that. Now, the sophists split into two main schools here. So, if morality is all relative or subjective, and there is no moral truth, what do? You got to do something. You got to behave in a certain way. So some sophists said, okay, here's what you do. This morality is all just, none of it's true, because there's no objective truth. It's all relative to your culture. It's all subjective. So what you do is follow the morality of society. Why? Well, if you act, against the morality of society, you can typically get in a lot of trouble. And so if you act in accord with the way the masses think you should act, you can win them over. You don't have to actually, believe any of this stuff, obviously, but they would recommend follow the morality of society, even though if you were trained by the sophist, you'd believe that none of it is true. Others endorsed adopting the appearance of being moral while actually acting in any way that led to success. So not only if you had one of these sophists as your teacher and accepted their views, not only would you not believe any of this morality stuff, you would actually use it as a mask. And what you'd really be doing is whatever led to success. So in public, you'd be careful to always appear to be virtuous, but when you're doing your real business, you do whatever it takes to succeed. Now later, our good dead friend Plato wrote, using the character of Socrates, the Republic, and in it is the famous story of the Ring of Gyges, in which there is the question of, if you could get away with being bad, why be good? And if you want to see more of that particular story and more about ethics, there is, of course, the ethics course. So why were these sophists so important? Well, one thing from the standpoint of philosophers, obviously, is this. They had a huge influence on Socrates and Plato, part of their origin story. According to Socrates and Plato, the sophists were too focused on the subjective aspects of knowledge and ethics. How so? Well, one general criticism is that the sophists didn't seem to get that even critical judgments require objective standards. Another major flaw is this. They push success, but did not really define or examine the notion of success. And one kind of paradox here is, if everything's relative, if you can't know anything, if its values are all subjective, then what would it be to succeed? And why would it even matter? If everything is relative and everything is skeptical, then why select success over failure? And what would be success? So kind of a problem there. Now, despite this, the Sophists were actually fairly important, at least from the standpoint of philosophers. Obviously from their own standpoint too. One factor is, in terms of their importance, was their influence on Socrates and Plato. As noted before, they're part of the origin story of Socrates and Plato. Now, the criticisms raised against the Sophists by Plato through Socrates were many, but they included the following. First, the Sophists were criticized for focusing too much on the subjective aspects of knowledge and ethics. Secondly, they were accused of failing to realize that even critical judgments required objective standards. That is to say, they can't make these critical judgments if they are embracing relativism. There's also the problem that they really didn't define or examine the notion of success. And they end up in a bit of a problem, because if they are skeptical, then how can you know what success is? If they're relativists or subjectivists, why accept any definition of success? Why not just accept failure? And so to say that success is better than failure would require either just saying, yeah, that's just what I do. I do success. Or the culture accepts success. But then subjectively, someone could say, well, failure is fine. And they would have no refutation for that. Now, despite these, they did make additional important contributions, in addition to being part of the origin story of Socrates and Plato. They did raise important philosophical questions and problems in epistemology, the theory of knowledge, ethics, and political theory, and so philosophers had to respond back to them. They also put a lot of emphasis on human concerns and very practical matters. And their skepticism undermined beliefs that were founded on mere dogmatism and tradition. And a key part of advancing knowledge involves undercutting that mere dogmatism and tradition. Their skepticism and their relativism presented a challenge to later thinkers, later philosophers, to develop better systems of knowledge, better systems of morality. They were, and still are, a challenge. Now, they were very concerned with language, and they helped develop logic, to be fair to them, rhetoric, and grammar. They also undercut tradition and provincialism. And of course, they motivated Socrates, who motivated Plato. Now, the Sophists did not vanish in ancient Greece. They are still around today. And the way to spot them, of course, is to look for their hallmarks. Again, they have the notion of skepticism, that you can't know things. Also relativism. A sophist, for example, would fully embrace the idea of there being alternative facts, or being no facts at all. And what matters most of all to the sophist is success. And today, if one is a sophist, one can find a pretty good career in politics and advertising. So the sophists never died. They actually never faded away. They're still alive and quite well, and doing especially well these days. Next, we'll move on from the sophists to our good dead friend, Socrates.